November 22nd, 1963, a date forever etched into the American consciousness. It was a sunny afternoon in Dallas, Texas, and President John F. Kennedy was riding through Dealey Plaza in an open-top limousine, waving to crowds of cheering supporters. But in just a matter of moments, 3 gunshots shattered the peace, plunging the country into a state of shock, grief, and confusion. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, had been assassinated. The nation watched in horror as the events of that fateful day unfolded, leaving a trail of questions. Questions that, even now, over 60 years later, still remain unanswered. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most controversial and widely debated events in American history, the assassination of President Kennedy. But why does this event continue to captivate the public imagination? What is it about this tragedy that has sparked countless theories, books, films, and investigations? Today, we'll not only revisit that tragic day in Dallas, but also explore the many questions that still linger. Was Lee Harvey Oswald truly the lone gunman? Did the government cover up key details? Or is it all simply a case of history's most infamous conspiracy theories? Over the next hour, we'll dig into the facts, analyze the most compelling evidence, and reflect on the impact that JFK's death had, not just on America, but on the world. So buckle up. We're about to journey into the heart of one of history's greatest mysteries. To truly understand the significance of John F. Kennedy's assassination, we first need to step back in time and explore the context in which it occurred. By November of 1963, JFK had been president for nearly 3 years, but in that short period, he'd already made an indelible mark on the world stage. A young, charismatic leader, Kennedy inspired hope in millions, symbolizing a new era for America. However, beneath the optimism, the United States was navigating a tense and volatile global landscape. Let's set the stage. It's the height of the Cold War. The world had come terrifyingly close to nuclear war just a year earlier during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet missile installations in Cuba, just 90 miles off the American coast. The standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had the world holding its breath for 13 days, as the possibility of a nuclear war loomed large. Kennedy's handling of the crisis, his willingness to negotiate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev while maintaining a hard stance, ultimately led to a peaceful resolution. The crisis cemented his reputation as a skillful leader, capable of walking the fine line between diplomacy and force. But while Kennedy was hailed as a hero for averting disaster, he had also made powerful enemies both abroad and at home. His administration was deeply involved in efforts to undermine communist regimes, particularly in Cuba. In 1961, just months into his presidency, Kennedy had authorized the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro using CIA-trained Cuban exiles. The operation was a disaster. Castro's forces easily defeated the invaders, and the failed mission became a major embarrassment for Kennedy and the U.S. government. Domestically, JFK's presidency was no less turbulent. Civil rights, for one, was a deeply divisive issue. The early 1960s saw America at the height of the civil rights movement, with African Americans fighting for equality and an end to segregation. Kennedy initially hesitated to take strong action on civil rights, fearing it would alienate Southern voters. But the growing unrest in the South, including the violent suppression of peaceful protests and the rise of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., forced him to take a firmer stand. In June of 1963, Kennedy gave a landmark address on civil rights, declaring that the struggle for racial equality was a moral issue as old as the American Revolution. He called for sweeping civil rights legislation, which would later become the foundation for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This, too, earned him powerful enemies, particularly among Southern segregationists, who were determined to resist federal efforts to end segregation and enforce voting rights. But it wasn't just civil rights and foreign policy that put pressure on Kennedy. His administration was also facing internal friction. Many in the intelligence community, particularly within the CIA, were dissatisfied with his leadership, especially after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. There was tension between the White House and the Pentagon, with military leaders viewing Kennedy's handling of the Cold War, particularly his reluctance to escalate the conflict in Vietnam, as too cautious. Add to this the mafia's growing disdain for the Kennedy family, thanks to Attorney General Robert Kennedy's aggressive anti-organized crime efforts, and you begin to see how many powerful groups had grievances with the president. So, let's talk about one of the most controversial figures in this story, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was born in 1939 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and had a troubled, fragmented upbringing. His father died before he was born, and his mother moved him around frequently, making it difficult for him to establish a stable life. By the time he was a teenager, Oswald had developed a strong interest in Marxism and socialism, ideals that stood in stark contrast to the American political climate of the time. In 1959, at the height of the Cold War, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. This was an unusual and highly suspicious move for an American, especially a former Marine. Oswald spent nearly 3 years in the Soviet Union, working in a factory and marrying a Russian woman, Marina Prusakova. But in 1962, disillusioned with life in the USSR, Oswald returned to the United States with his wife and infant daughter. Upon his return, Oswald's life remained unstable. He struggled to hold down jobs, moved frequently, and seemed to drift aimlessly between political ideologies. He expressed admiration for both the Soviet Union and Cuba and became active in pro-Castro movements. In the months leading up to the assassination, Oswald even visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City, allegedly seeking a visa to travel to Cuba. Oswald's political leanings and erratic behavior made him a figure of interest, but he was not widely known before November 22, 1963. That would all change on that fateful day in Dallas. It's November 22, 1963. The day begins like any other, but for the city of Dallas, Texas, it will soon become a day that will forever haunt the collective memory of a nation. President John F. Kennedy is in Texas as part of a political trip designed to bolster support for his re-election campaign. Accompanied by his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, as well as Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, Kennedy is riding in a motorcade through downtown Dallas. The crowds are enthusiastic, waving and cheering as the president's open-top limousine glides through Dealey Plaza. At 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade turns onto Elm Street and passes in front of the Texas School Book Depository, the unimaginable happens. Three shots ring out. The crowd is stunned, unsure at first of what has just occurred. But in the next few moments, the horror becomes all too clear. President Kennedy slumps forward, a bullet having struck him in the upper back, exiting through his throat, and a second shot, the fatal one, hits him in the head. Governor Connally, seated in front of Kennedy, is also hit but survives the attack. As the motorcade speeds toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, confusion spreads throughout Dealey Plaza. Witnesses describe hearing shots from different directions, some claiming they came from the Texas School Book Depository behind the motorcade, others believing they heard shots from a grassy knoll to the right of the president's car. At Parkland Hospital, doctors work frantically to save the president, but at 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy is pronounced dead. America has lost its leader, and the world stands still. 30 minutes later, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been riding a few cars behind Kennedy, is sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard Air Force One, with Jackie Kennedy standing beside him, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit. But while the nation mourns, law enforcement immediately springs into action. Within minutes of the shooting, police begin to search the Texas school book depository, where witnesses claimed they saw a man with a rifle in one of the sixth-floor windows. It's here, in this building, that officers find a rifle, an Italian-made Mannlicher Carcano, tucked away near a stack of boxes, along with spent shell casings. A search of the building's records soon leads them to a suspect, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee at the depository. Oswald is quickly apprehended, but not for the assassination. He's arrested after allegedly shooting and killing Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit about 45 minutes after the president's death. He's taken into custody at the Texas Theater after a brief struggle with officers. Back at the police station, Oswald is questioned for hours, and despite the overwhelming suspicion, he maintains his innocence, famously declaring, "I'm just a patsy." He denies any involvement in the assassination, claiming he didn't shoot anyone. Just 2 days later, on November 24th, Oswald is being transferred from the city jail to the county jail. As he walks through the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, surrounded by officers and press, a man suddenly steps out from the crowd. It's Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, who shoots Oswald point-blank in the stomach, killing him. The nation, already reeling from the loss of its president, is now left in disbelief. The man accused of the crime is dead, and with him, many believe the truth about what really happened in Dealey Plaza. But despite Oswald's death, the investigation continues. The official inquiry, led by the Warren Commission, would later conclude that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he fired the 3 shots from the Texas school book depository. They determined that there was no conspiracy, no second shooter. However, many Americans were, and still are, unsatisfied with the official narrative. The Zapruder film, which captured the assassination on 8mm film, seemed to show the president's head moving backward after the fatal shot, a movement that many argued was inconsistent with a shot fired from behind. This single frame of the film would ignite decades of debate. Eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza also gave conflicting reports. Some claimed they heard shots from the grassy knoll, while others described the sounds echoing from multiple directions. In the years that followed, numerous conspiracy theories emerged, suggesting everything from CIA involvement to the mafia to foreign governments playing a role in Kennedy's death. One of the most debated points was Oswald's background. A former Marine, he had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 and returned to the U.S. in 1962. His known communist sympathies and his visits to both the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City, just weeks before the assassination, only fueled speculation that his actions may have been part of a larger plot. And then, of course, there's Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Oswald before he could stand trial. Why did Ruby, a man with known connections to organized crime, take matters into his own hands? Was he simply avenging the president, as he claimed, or was there a more sinister motive? The questions surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy are as complex as they are numerous. Officially, the case is closed, but for many, the mystery remains very much alive. What really happened on that fateful day in Dallas? Was Oswald the lone gunman, or was there more at play? And will we ever truly know? From the moment shots were fired in Dealey Plaza, the Kennedy assassination became the focus of intense scrutiny. The official investigation, conducted by the Warren Commission, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, but not everyone accepted that conclusion. In fact, over 60% of Americans to this day believe there was more to the story. What makes this event so ripe for conspiracy theories? Is it because of the chaotic events in the days that followed? The conflicting eyewitness accounts? Or is there evidence of something deeper, darker at play? We'll dive into some of the most prominent conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. From the idea of a second shooter on the grassy knoll, to the alleged involvement of the CIA, the mafia, and even foreign governments, we'll explore why these theories continue to captivate the public imagination. Let's start with what might be the most enduring and well-known conspiracy theory: the idea that there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll. Dealey Plaza, the site of the assassination, is a relatively open area with a few notable landmarks. On one side was the Texas School Book Depository, where the Warren Commission says Oswald fired the fatal shots. On the other side, a small, sloping patch of grass, known as the grassy knoll. Many eyewitnesses at the scene that day reported hearing shots coming from this area. Some even claimed to have seen a puff of smoke or movement behind a fence on the knoll. The idea that a second gunman could have fired from the grassy knoll is supported by what's known as the acoustic evidence. A police officer's open microphone captured a recording during the shooting, and some experts who analyzed it claimed to have detected the sound of 4 shots, not 3. But if that's the case and there were multiple shooters, this would imply a coordinated attack, a conspiracy. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which conducted its own investigation in the late 1970s, even concluded that there was a high probability that a second gunman was involved. However, their findings were based largely on this acoustic evidence, which has since been challenged by other analysts. Still, the idea of a second shooter remains one of the most popular conspiracy theories, fueled in part by the famous Zapruder film. If you've seen the footage, you might recall the moment when Kennedy is fatally shot. His head jerks backward, a movement that many argue is inconsistent with a shot coming from behind, where Oswald was positioned. This backward motion has led some to believe that Kennedy was struck by a shot from the front, possibly from the grassy knoll. While the official autopsy concluded that all shots came from behind, the debate over the film rages on, making the grassy knoll theory one of the most enduring aspects of the JFK assassination mystery. Another prominent theory points to the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. But why would the CIA want to assassinate the President of the United States? To understand this theory, we need to go back to the early 1960s. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where a CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba failed spectacularly, tensions between the CIA and Kennedy began to escalate. Kennedy was reportedly furious with the CIA's handling of the operation, feeling they had misled him about its chances of success. In the aftermath, JFK famously said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He even fired CIA Director Allen Dulles. This power struggle between Kennedy and the CIA has fueled speculation that the agency may have orchestrated his assassination. The theory goes that elements within the CIA were unhappy with Kennedy's foreign policy, especially his unwillingness to escalate the conflict in Vietnam, and saw him as a threat to their covert operations. Some even point to the fact that after the assassination, Dulles, the man Kennedy fired, was appointed to the Warren Commission, leading some to believe this was an attempt to cover up CIA involvement. Another key figure in this theory is a man named David Ferrie, a former CIA pilot with alleged ties to anti-Castro groups and the mafia. Ferrie was investigated by District Attorney Jim Garrison in the 1960s, who believed Ferrie had connections to Oswald and that the assassination was part of a larger conspiracy involving the CIA. Ferrie's sudden death in 1967, ruled as a suicide, only added fuel to these suspicions. But despite the circumstantial evidence and mistrust in the agency, no conclusive proof of CIA involvement has ever been uncovered. However, documents declassified in recent years, including those related to Operation Mongoose, a secret U.S. program to overthrow Castro, continue to keep this theory alive. Let's shift to another powerful group with a motive: the mafia. The theory here suggests that organized crime may have played a role in Kennedy's assassination. The connection between the Kennedys and the mafia is complicated. During JFK's election campaign in 1960, it's been suggested that mafia bosses, particularly in Chicago, helped deliver key votes that ensured his victory. But once Kennedy was in office, his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime, targeting mafia leaders with a series of high-profile prosecutions. This betrayal didn't sit well with the mafia. Many speculate that the mob orchestrated the assassination in retaliation for the crackdown, with the help of figures like Jack Ruby, who shot Oswald. Ruby had known ties to organized crime, and while he claimed he killed Oswald to spare Jackie Kennedy from the ordeal of a trial, some believe he was silencing Oswald to cover up the mafia's involvement. But like other theories, the mafia connection is difficult to prove. While there's plenty of circumstantial evidence, such as Ruby's connections to the underworld and the Kennedys' ties to organized crime, there is no definitive proof linking the mafia to the assassination. Finally, we can't ignore the international angle. Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, where he lived for nearly 3 years before returning to the US. Many conspiracy theorists argue that his ties to the Soviets, as well as his pro-Castro sympathies, indicate that either the Soviet Union or Cuba could have been behind the assassination. At the time of Kennedy's death, the Cold War was at its peak, and tensions with both nations were incredibly high. Fidel Castro's Cuba had just survived the US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had been humiliated by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Could either have had a motive to kill Kennedy? The theory suggests that Oswald, as a self-proclaimed Marxist, might have been recruited by either the Soviets or the Cubans to carry out the assassination as revenge for US interference in their affairs. Oswald's visit to the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City just weeks before the assassination only adds to the suspicion. But again, no hard evidence has ever been uncovered linking either country to the assassination. From the grassy knoll to the CIA, the mafia, and even foreign governments, the conspiracy theories surrounding JFK's assassination are as complex as they are numerous. While the official record holds that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, the unanswered questions and inconsistencies in the evidence continue to fuel speculation. Was it simply the work of a lone gunman? Or was there a larger conspiracy at play? Perhaps we'll never know for sure, but one thing remains certain. The events of November 22, 1963, changed the course of American history forever, leaving behind a mystery that continues to captivate and haunt us to this day. For nearly 6 decades, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy has fascinated historians, investigators, and conspiracy theorists alike. In this next part of the podcast, we'll turn to the experts, the people who have spent their careers studying the events of November 22, 1963. What do they think happened that day in Dealey Plaza? And how have their perspectives shaped the ongoing debates about who really killed JFK? Let's start with the official story. According to the Warren Commission, which was formed just days after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing President Kennedy. The commission, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, reviewed thousands of pieces of evidence and testimony, ultimately concluding that Oswald fired 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository. The forensic evidence, the ballistic evidence, and the trajectory of the bullets all support the conclusion that Oswald fired from the 6th floor of the depository. While conspiracy theories persist, the Commission's findings remain the most thoroughly vetted account of the assassination. Dr. Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, a prominent defense of the lone gunman theory. Experts like Dr. Gerald Posner argue that the Warren Commission's findings have stood the test of time. Posner points out that modern forensic analysis, including ballistic trajectory studies and computer simulations, consistently supports the idea that Oswald acted alone. According to Posner and others, the physical evidence, the rifle found on the 6th floor, the bullet casings, and the wounds on Kennedy and Governor Connally, fit the scenario laid out by the Commission. The so-called magic bullet theory, which many conspiracy theorists point to as proof of a second shooter, is actually entirely plausible when you consider the angles and positioning of the people in the limousine. Modern reconstructions have shown that it's possible for a single bullet to have caused the injuries to both Kennedy and Connally. Dr. John McAdams, political science professor and JFK assassination researcher. But despite this evidence, many Americans remain unconvinced. According to a 2023 Gallup poll, over 60% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy behind Kennedy's death. One of the most vocal critics of the Warren Commission's findings is James DiEugenio, a researcher and author who has spent decades investigating the assassination. DiEugenio and others argue that the commission ignored or overlooked critical evidence, particularly eyewitness testimony and forensic inconsistencies. The Warren Commission rushed to conclude that Oswald acted alone, but they ignored key witnesses who reported hearing shots from the grassy knoll. There are too many unanswered questions, such as the acoustic evidence, the discrepancies in the medical reports, and Oswald's connections to intelligence agencies, that make the lone gunman theory hard to believe. James DiEugenio, author of Destiny Betrayed and co-author of the JFK Assassination. The evidence today. Critics like DiEugenio point to what they see as inconsistencies in the forensic evidence. For example, the Parkland Hospital doctors who initially treated Kennedy's wounds described an entry wound in the front of his throat, which would imply a shot from the front. However, the official autopsy report, conducted later at Bethesda Naval Hospital, concluded that all shots came from behind. The medical evidence is one of the most contentious aspects of the case. Several of the doctors who saw Kennedy at Parkland initially believed he had been shot from the front, yet their accounts were later dismissed or overshadowed by the official autopsy. This is why so many people believe there was a cover-up. Dr. Cyril Wecht, forensic pathologist and critic of the Warren Commission. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a prominent forensic pathologist, has long challenged the findings of the Warren Commission, arguing that the discrepancies in the medical reports suggest the possibility of multiple shooters. Wecht is one of several experts who believes the autopsy was mishandled, leaving too many unanswered questions about the nature of Kennedy's wounds. The enduring belief in a conspiracy is not just about the evidence. It's also a reflection of the political and cultural landscape of the 1960s. The Kennedy assassination occurred during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history, with the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and growing distrust in government institutions. People want to believe there was a conspiracy because the idea that a lone gunman could take down a figure as significant as JFK is unsettling. Conspiracy theories provide a more satisfying explanation. They suggest that a larger, more sinister force was responsible. In a sense, it helps people make sense of the chaos of the 1960s. Dr. Peter Knight, professor of American Studies and author of Conspiracy Culture, From Kennedy to the X-Files. Dr. Peter Knight, an expert on conspiracy culture, argues that the Kennedy assassination has become the quintessential modern conspiracy theory. In part, this is because JFK represented so much hope for a better future. The abrupt and violent end to his life seemed, to many, too tragic to have been the work of one man acting alone. Knight also points out that the political scandals that followed Watergate, the revelations of CIA covert activities, and the Vietnam War contributed to a growing sense of distrust in the government. This distrust helped conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination gain even more traction in the public consciousness. So where does that leave us? The experts who defend the Warren Commission argue that the evidence points to Oswald as the lone gunman. But critics maintain that too many inconsistencies and unanswered questions remain. The assassination of John F. Kennedy has become a symbol of a broader cultural divide between those who trust the official narrative and those who believe the truth is still hidden. And as long as that divide exists, the mystery of JFK's death will continue to captivate us. And so, as we come to the end of this episode, we're left with more questions than answers. The assassination of John F. Kennedy is a mystery that continues to intrigue, divide, and haunt us. Whether you believe the official account, are convinced by the conspiracy theories, or, like many, are unsure, What's undeniable is the lasting impact JFK's death had on history. It changed the way we see our leaders, the way we trust our institutions, and the way we understand the fragile nature of hope. But this story is about more than just the facts of November 22, 1963. It's a reflection of how we, as a society, cope with the unthinkable, how we search for truth in the face of tragedy, and how we wrestle with the complexities of power, loss, and legacy. In the next episode of A Podcast About Anything, we'll dive into the life and legacy of another controversial figure, one who shaped the fate of an entire nation and dominated headlines for over 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi. From his rise to power in Libya to his violent downfall during the Arab Spring, Gaddafi's story is one of dictatorship, revolution, and international intrigue. Who was the man behind the iconic military uniform and sunglasses? And how did his reign come to such a dramatic and bloody end? Join us as we explore Gaddafi's rise, his bizarre leadership style, and the global forces that eventually led to his demise. It's a story of power, politics, and revolution that you won't want to miss. Thank you for tuning in to A Podcast About Anything. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's most compelling figures and events. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and share it with others who are fascinated by the mysteries of the past. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed.